100 years ago, a ship left Earth with promises of discovery, knowledge, and glory. Its name was whispered in every household. Its mission carried the hopes of an entire generation, and then silence. The ship vanished beyond the stars, swallowed by the abyss of time, leaving nothing but grief, mystery, and unanswered questions. For decades, scientists speculated, families mourned, and storytellers turned the tragedy into myth. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the universe does not forgive recklessness. Yet today, against all odds, the impossible has happened. That same ship has returned, emerging from the void as if a century were no more than a single breath. Think about it for a moment. An entire crew presumed dead, yet their vessel floats back to our orbit, intact, as if untouched by time. No sign of decay, no record of travel, no trace of 100 years passing. It raises a terrifying question. Where has this ship been? And what did it encounter in the vast unknown? Some will claim it's a miracle, others a hoax, but the truth might be far stranger. Because when we opened its doors, the ship revealed something no one could have predicted. This isn't just another story of space exploration gone wrong. This is a story of vanishing time, of altered reality, of something or someone that dared to interfere with human destiny. It's about what happens when humanity pushes beyond the limits of the known and the universe pushes back. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. These are the recovered records, the whispered fragments pieced together from what was found on board. The ship's return is no happy ending. It is the beginning of a greater question that could redefine not only our understanding of the cosmos, but the fate of every living soul on Earth. Now imagine standing at the edge of history. A vessel thought lost forever suddenly cast its shadow across the planet once more. Governments scramble, scientists rush to unlock its secrets, and ordinary people are left staring at the sky in disbelief. Some wonder if it's truly the same ship, or a copy, a replica built by something we cannot comprehend. Others whisper that the crew, if still alive, might not be entirely human anymore. This story demands attention because it isn't about the past, it's about now. The ship didn't return a century later by chance. There's intention here, something hidden in its reappearance, a purpose that must be uncovered before it's too late. Each clue drags us deeper, each detail forcing us to confront a truth so uncomfortable, it will shake the very foundations of science, faith, and identity. What waits inside a ship frozen in time for 100 years? What voice echoes in its silent halls? And most importantly, why did it come back now, at this exact moment in history? Prepare yourself, because this is not just the account of a ship. This is the unraveling of a cosmic puzzle, a confrontation with forces we were never meant to disturb. The journey begins here, with the return of a vessel that should never have come back. And once you hear what happened inside, you'll never look at the stars the same way again. Before the ship disappeared, it sent one final signal to Earth. A short, fragmented transmission, filled with static and distorted voices. At first, it sounded like ordinary interference, but when decoded, it revealed something chilling. A voice repeating the same phrase again and again. We are not alone. No coordinates, no technical failure, no explanation of what went wrong. Just those words, whispered like a warning, followed by silence. For years, scientists argued over its authenticity. Was it a malfunction? A desperate cry from a crew already facing disaster? Or was it proof of an encounter that humanity was never supposed to know about? Whatever it was, that fragment became the seed of countless theories. Some believed the ship crossed paths with an alien intelligence. Others thought it was swallowed by a cosmic anomaly, a wormhole, a rift in space-time, something beyond human comprehension. Yet with no wreckage, no debris, no beacon, there was no closure. Families of the crew clung to hope, while skeptics dismissed the incident as a tragic failure. Another lost dream in the dangerous pursuit of space exploration. But the truth hid in plain sight, locked in that final message. Because when the ship returned, the very first thing investigators did was replay the transmission. And what they discovered sent shivers across every agency monitoring the event. The voice was still there, repeating the same phrase. But now, layered beneath it, there was something new. Another voice, deeper, almost mechanical, muttering words no one could decipher. The kind of voice that doesn't sound human, but doesn't sound entirely artificial either. It was as if the signal had been growing, evolving, changing on its own during the ship's absence. That single recording reignited every theory, but one detail was impossible to ignore. The message had continued to broadcast across a century of silence, and its last repetition synced perfectly with the moment the ship reappeared in orbit. That meant it wasn't random, it was intentional. Something, or someone, wanted the world to hear those words exactly at the moment the ship came back. And now the real question emerged. If the ship was silent for 100 years, who or what had been speaking all this time through its transmission? When the ship finally reappeared, it wasn't through some dramatic cosmic storm or fiery crash landing. It was quiet, almost unnerving. One moment the skies above Earth were empty, and in the next, radar stations picked up a signal that hadn't been detected for a century. The vessel slipped back into orbit as if it had never been gone, pristine and untouched, carrying the same name and registry that had been etched into spacefaring history books as lost forever. What made the event more disturbing was its condition. Analysts expected wreckage, or at the very least, signs of decay from 100 years adrift. But instead, the ship looked brand new. No corrosion, no structural wear, not even a hint of micrometeoroid damage. Every panel gleamed as though it had just rolled out of the shipyard. To those watching the feeds, it was like a ghost had returned in perfect flesh. The scientific community immediately clashed. Some swore it was an elaborate hoax, an identical replica launched by some unknown power. Others suggested it had slipped into a temporal fold, preserved in time and expelled exactly 100 years later. But if that was true, then how did the signal continue transmitting across the decades? How could a ship lost in another dimension still speak to Earth in real time? There was one more detail that sent shivers through the observers. The ship had returned not to deep orbit, not drifting randomly in space, but to the exact same trajectory it was on the day it vanished. Perfectly aligned, as though it had simply paused for a century and then resumed its path. That precision was not the mark of chance. It suggested control, intention, design. Military satellites locked onto it immediately. Governments scrambled to conceal the discovery, but the sheer scale of the event made secrecy impossible. Amateur astronomers scanning the skies that night spotted the vessel too. Within hours, the entire world knew. The lost ship had returned. Crowds gathered across cities, watching live feeds, waiting for officials to explain what was happening. Yet the longer the silence stretched, the heavier the unease became. The ship was just there, floating silently, broadcasting its eerie signal over and over. We are not alone. And then, without warning, its engines activated. Not at full power, but with just enough thrust to lower it from orbit. The ship was coming back to Earth. And no one could answer the most important question of all. Was it coming home on its own? Or was something else bringing it back? As the ship began its descent, governments had no choice but to act. International protocols for first contact, dusty manuals written decades earlier for purely theoretical scenarios, were suddenly pulled out and rushed into practice. But those procedures had always assumed one thing, that humanity would encounter something new, something unknown. They had never anticipated that the threat, or the mystery, might arrive wearing a familiar face. The vessel in orbit wasn't alien by design. It was human, unmistakably so. Its architecture matched the blueprints archived in museums, its insignia identical to the one printed in every textbook about early space exploration. That familiarity should have been comforting. Instead, it made the situation more unsettling, because if the ship looked unchanged after 100 years, the real question was, what else inside it hadn't changed? Military fleets positioned themselves around the projected landing zone, creating a perimeter designed both to protect civilians and to keep prying eyes away. But secrecy was no longer possible. Every major news outlet on the planet was streaming the descent live. Billions watched as the lost vessel, glowing faintly against the upper atmosphere, cut its way through the night sky. Inside command centers, tension grew. Some officials argued to intercept and destroy it before it could touch Earth. Too many unknowns, too much risk. Others insisted on restraint, warning that an act of aggression could trigger consequences no one could predict. After all, if the ship had been manipulated or altered by an outside intelligence, striking it down might be seen as a declaration of war. So the world held its breath and allowed the vessel to land. Searchlights followed its path. Cameras zoomed in as it slowed above the surface, hovering with precision that seemed almost too perfect. It touched down with no tremor, no turbulence, as though invisible hands had gently placed it back where it belonged. The silence that followed was deafening. No hatch opened. No crew emerged. The ship simply sat there, motionless, humming faintly, broadcasting its endless message. We are not alone. It was at that moment the realization struck. The real danger wasn't the ship itself. It was whatever, or whoever, might still be inside. Teams of specialists surrounded the ship, each step taken with both awe and dread. Floodlights illuminated its metallic skin, gleaming as though time had never touched it. The closer they moved, the clearer it became that the vessel was flawless, far too flawless. The hull bore no scorch marks from re-entry, no scratches from its journey, no signs of fatigue at all. It was as though it had been preserved, or rebuilt, with a precision beyond human engineering. Attention focused on the main hatch. This was supposed to be the point of entry, but when specialists attempted to access it, they found no response. The manual override levers weren't jammed or rusted, they simply weren't there anymore. Panels where physical mechanisms should have been were smooth, as though the ship had been redesigned from within its own frame. Using scanners, they tried to peer inside. Thermal readings returned inconsistent results. Sometimes the sensors showed an interior colder than the vacuum of space. Sometimes it registered heat signatures fluctuating in impossible rhythms, almost like a heartbeat pulsing across the entire vessel. That detail alone was enough to unsettle even the most skeptical minds. The hatch was then bombarded with every method available: electronic signals, cutting torches, resonance pulses, even explosive charges. Nothing left a mark. The material wasn't just stronger than known alloys. It behaved as though it absorbed and nullified every attempt to break it. The ship wasn't defending itself violently, but it didn't need to. Its silence was defense enough. Hours turned into days. The ship remained sealed. Its only communication, the looping broadcast repeating the same phrase: "We are not alone." But there was a change, subtle but undeniable. The tone of the voice began to distort. What once sounded like a desperate human warning now shifted in timbre, growing deeper, stretched, almost metallic. Some insisted it was interference. Others were convinced it was deliberate, as if the voice itself was evolving each time it played. Then came the first anomaly. Late one night, as the teams maintained their vigil, the hatch released a faint hiss, like the exhale of something alive. No movement followed. The ship remained sealed, but from that moment on, everyone who stood too close swore they could hear whispers vibrating in the metal. Whispers that didn't belong to the recording. Whispers that felt like they were trying to speak directly into their minds. It became clear, whatever was inside wasn't locked out. It was locked in. At first, the whispers were dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations. After all, the teams stationed around the vessel hadn't slept properly in days, and their nerves were frayed by the tension of standing guard over a mystery no one could explain. But the reports multiplied. Different people from different backgrounds began describing the same thing: low, overlapping voices pressing into their minds, always just out of reach, like words you almost understand in a language you don't speak. The phenomenon was quickly named the whisper effect. It wasn't limited to those near the hatch. Technicians monitoring the ship's transmissions from remote stations reported hearing faint murmurs layered beneath the main signal. When they tried to isolate the audio, the whispers disappeared, as though they existed only when heard directly, never when recorded. Even stranger, the voices weren't random. People exposed to them began to develop patterns of behavior that hadn't existed before. Soldiers on perimeter duty would unconsciously walk toward the vessel, stopping only when forcibly pulled back. Scientists reported dreams of landscapes that didn't exist. Vast oceans of black glass, skies filled with shifting constellations, and towering structures that seemed both alien and hauntingly familiar. The most unsettling aspect was that the dreams weren't unique. Individuals who had never spoken to each other described identical imagery, down to the smallest detail. It was as though the ship was planting a single vision into the minds of anyone who came too close. And the more time they spent near it, the harder it became to separate the dreams from waking life. Officials tried to rotate staff, limiting exposure, but the effect lingered. Some carried the whispers with them long after leaving the site. They described it like a hum lodged in the back of their skulls, sometimes silent, sometimes rising to a chorus of voices speaking in unison. A chorus that always repeated the same idea. It is waiting. Medical scans found nothing unusual, no brain damage, no auditory abnormalities, nothing measurable. And yet the changes were undeniable. Memory lapses, sudden mood swings, even loss of time were reported by those who had stayed longest near the ship. It was as if the vessel wasn't just communicating. It was testing them, probing their minds, learning how to shape their thoughts. The more the phenomenon spread, the more urgent the central question became. If the ship was speaking in whispers, then who or what was listening back? Finally, after weeks of failed attempts to open the hatch, a decision was made to attempt a controlled breach using a combination of advanced technology and extreme precision. When the hatch slowly began to shift, the world watched in tense silence, broadcast live across every screen. And then, for the first time in a century, the crew stepped out. At first glance, they looked exactly as the records from 100 years ago described. Uniforms immaculate, expressions composed, movements deliberate. There was no sign of aging, no hint of the long decades spent missing. But the closer the specialists examined them, the more unsettling the picture became. Their eyes held an intensity that was unnerving, an awareness of things no human should be capable of perceiving. They spoke in perfect English, yet occasionally slipped into phrases that seemed foreign. Words that weren't in any known language, or perhaps were echoes of something ancient that had imprinted itself on their minds. Medical teams immediately scanned their bodies. Vital signs were normal, but metabolic activity and neural patterns were unlike anything ever recorded. The crew's physiology had been altered subtly yet fundamentally, adapted for an environment that remained a complete mystery. Their muscles, bones, and senses were sharper, their reaction times instantaneous, their cognitive abilities hyper-accelerated. It was as if the ship itself had reprogrammed them over the century they were lost, training them for something no one could comprehend. The psychological impact on Earth's observers was immediate. Governments debated containment versus communication. Scientists feared contagion, biological, mental, or both. The world collectively held its breath, unsure whether to welcome them as heroes or fear them as strangers. Every question about what had happened, where they had been, and why the ship returned remained unanswered, and the crew seemed unwilling or unable to clarify. Then came the first indication that their return wasn't simply a rescue or miracle. One of the crew members made a gesture, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it triggered a series of responses from the ship itself. Lights pulsed, walls shimmered, and the previously inert interior seemed to awaken, responding to their presence with an intelligence that was impossible to quantify. Observers realized the crew had become part of the ship. Their minds were connected, integrated with its systems in ways no human technology could replicate. And that realization made one terrifying fact clear. The ship hadn't returned them to Earth merely to be seen. It had returned them as emissaries, agents of something that had been waiting in the void for 100 years. Something patient, something calculating, and something no human mind was prepared to confront. As the crew settled into quarantine protocols, scientists finally gained limited access to the interior of the ship. Inside, they found an archive unlike any database previously encountered. Rows of crystalline data cores stretched along corridors, pulsating with a subtle light. Each core appeared to contain memories, recordings, and logs, not only of the crew's journey, but of events that defied explanation. Some logs were mundane, documenting course corrections, system checks, and communications with Earth before the disappearance. Others were fragmented, showing star systems that didn't exist on any chart, planets with atmospheres and life forms impossible by known physics. Still others contained sequences that appeared to depict the passage of time differently, as if decades had compressed into minutes or stretched into centuries. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a repository of temporal anomalies, storing experiences in a non-linear fashion. The scientists realized something astonishing. The ship itself had been recording, observing, and cataloging phenomena beyond human understanding. Every star, every black hole, every particle anomaly it had encountered seemed to be mapped and encoded in ways that suggested intelligence. Not just the crew's intelligence, but a system-wide consciousness. The vessel had learned, adapted, and evolved during its absence. But the most alarming discovery came when the logs began to reveal interactions between the ship and the crew. The crew had not merely survived, they had been changed. Their memories intertwined with the ship's processes, their thoughts mirrored in the crystalline cores. Events that had originally seemed impossible now became horrifyingly plausible. The crew had communicated with something outside the known universe, an intelligence that transcended matter and time. Some recordings included visual data, showing landscapes of impossible geometry, cities suspended in energy fields, and beings whose forms fluctuated between dimensions. The crew moved through these places as if guided, their actions purposeful, their faces calm, unafraid. And yet, there were entries marked with warnings, cautionary notes about interactions that could not be reversed. It became clear that the ship's return was not arbitrary. Its record suggested an unfinished mission, a purpose that spanned more than human lifetimes. Whoever or whatever had guided the vessel had been patient, waiting a century to bring it back to the point where humanity could witness, but not yet comprehend, what had been discovered. The archives were complete, yet every answer raised more questions. And as the team reviewed the final logs, a chilling conclusion emerged. The ship had been waiting for something or someone to read them. As the crew and specialists delved deeper into the ship's interior, subtle but unmistakable signs of alteration became apparent. The vessel was no longer simply a product of early 21st century engineering. It had transformed in ways that defied comprehension. Walls seemed to shift imperceptibly, corridors appeared longer or shorter depending on one's perspective, and instruments displayed readings that contradicted themselves. Gravity fluctuated in small pockets, and light bent at angles that made familiar geometry feel alien. The crew themselves displayed changes that were just as unsettling. Their physiology was enhanced, skin that resisted damage, reflexes far beyond human limits, and senses attuned to dimensions that Earth's instruments could not detect. But the deeper transformation was mental. Cognitive patterns were no longer strictly human. Their thoughts were rapid, layered, almost holographic, able to perceive multiple outcomes simultaneously. They experienced time differently, recalling events from the century they had vanished as if they had happened yesterday. Even their emotions had shifted. There was an intensity that unsettled the scientists observing them, a calmness that bordered on alien detachment. When questioned, the crew answered, but often in ways that were frustratingly vague, as though speaking directly would not convey the truth. They seemed to understand more than they could explain, and the sense that the ship itself guided their actions was undeniable. The vessel's systems had also adapted. Machines that should have required manual operation were now responsive to thought alone. Energy flowed in patterns that suggested self-optimization, as if the ship anticipated needs before they were consciously recognized. Every sensor, every computer, every control panel was subtly linked to the consciousness of the crew, creating a symbiosis that challenged the limits of biology and technology. What became most alarming was the realization that this alteration wasn't static, it was ongoing. The ship was still changing them, still evolving internally. Every experiment, every observation conducted by Earth's teams became part of a feedback loop. The vessel seemed to learn, not just from its crew, but from humanity itself. This revelation forced the ultimate question to the forefront. If the ship could alter its crew, and if it could adapt to humanity, then what was its true purpose? Was it a relic of exploration, or a sentient entity with motives beyond comprehension? And if it was aware, had it returned voluntarily, or was it luring humanity towards something far more consequential? Exploration of the ship's inner systems revealed phenomena that defied every principle of physics known to humanity. Power conduits did not rely on conventional energy sources. They pulsed with an unknown force, generating output far exceeding theoretical limits. Sensors picked up radiation signatures that contradicted their own readings, as if the ship existed, partially outside the known spectrum of matter and energy. Instruments designed to measure temperature, pressure, or chemical composition frequently returned conflicting data. A compartment might register freezing on one scanner, yet thermometers showed warmth. Liquids and gases behaved unpredictably, sometimes appearing to hover mid-air, forming patterns before dispersing without reason. The environment within the vessel was not chaotic, however. It followed rules entirely alien to humans, but consistent within the ship itself. One of the most disturbing discoveries involved the navigation systems. While the exterior hull preserved the ship's original coordinates, interior maps revealed pathways to locations that didn't exist in any known star catalog. Planets, asteroid fields, and cosmic phenomena appeared in the logs that had no correspondence to observable reality. Some of these locations were unstable, fluctuating in dimensional alignment, accessible only through corridors within the ship, that acted as conduits to these impossible destinations. Communication arrays presented another anomaly. Attempts to intercept, record, or decode the ship's transmissions often failed. Signals would alter midstream, not in distortion, but in content, producing messages that shifted depending on who monitored them. Specialists hypothesized that the ship was selectively interacting with observers' cognition, choosing what each mind could perceive, creating a personalized interface. Even the most mundane systems, life support, temperature regulation, environmental controls, had subtle irregularities. Oxygen levels fluctuated slightly out of phase with sensors. Atmospheric density shifted imperceptibly, giving the sensation of being slightly heavier or lighter in different areas. Time itself seemed inconsistent inside, with minutes stretching or contracting, leaving individuals disoriented and questioning their own perception. Every anomaly pointed toward one undeniable conclusion. The ship was no longer a simple machine. It had become a self-contained ecosystem, a hybrid of intelligence, biology, and physics. The vessel had evolved while absent from human observation, and its return to Earth was not merely a historical event. It was the arrival of a living, thinking entity capable of rewriting the rules of existence itself. As analysts continued to study the ship's systems, they discovered something extraordinary embedded deep within the vessel's code. A hidden message, encoded not in the usual binary or symbols, but in a pattern of energy pulses that resonated through the ship itself. At first, it seemed like a technical artifact, a remnant of the original mission software. But repeated analysis revealed a structure far too deliberate to be accidental. The message wasn't simply readable. It required the observer to interact with the ship in a very specific way. Sensors, lights, even the vibrations of the hull acted as components of a puzzle. When approached with the proper synchronization, the pulses formed shapes, colors, and sequences that conveyed information directly to the mind of the observer. It was as if the ship had developed a language designed not for speech, but for thought itself. Early attempts to interpret the message resulted in confusion, mental strain, and in some cases, hallucinations. Researchers reported visions of distant galaxies, unimaginable structures, and phenomena that seemed to exist outside conventional space-time. Some believed they were glimpsing the ship's journey during its century-long disappearance. Others argued the visions were a test, measuring the cognitive limits of those attempting to understand. As decoding progressed, one pattern became unmistakable. The ship wasn't merely documenting events, it was issuing instructions. The sequence implied an objective, a destination, and a purpose that extended beyond the ship's own existence. Whoever or whatever had guided the vessel during its disappearance had prepared this message for the minds of those on Earth, and it was precise, adaptive, and unnervingly intelligent. But embedded within the message was something darker. Hidden beneath the instructions were warnings, subtle yet terrifying. References to temporal instability, to human unpreparedness, and to consequences that extended far beyond comprehension. The ship's return wasn't benign, it was deliberate, and the hidden message made it clear that whoever or whatever orchestrated the journey expected humans to act, and failure to do so could be catastrophic. As the realization spread, the stakes became obvious. The ship wasn't just a vessel of exploration. It was a messenger, a test, and potentially a harbinger. Its message demanded attention, demanded understanding, and demanded a response. And the world now faced a terrifying truth. They were not dealing with a ship lost to time. They were confronting an intelligence that had returned for a reason. As scientists analyzed the ship's logs and environmental data, they noticed something impossible. Time inside the vessel did not follow linear rules. Chronometers showed discrepancies, with minutes stretching into hours, and hours sometimes collapsing into seconds. Equipment that should have aged a century showed no wear, while other systems appeared to have evolved independently, as though living and growing in accelerated time. The temporal distortion wasn't uniform. Certain sections of the ship experienced time normally, while others seemed trapped in loops or stretches, creating corridors where events could replay themselves endlessly or vanish entirely from perception. Even the crew reported confusion. They described sequences where they relived past events, remembered experiences that hadn't happened yet, and glimpsed outcomes that had not yet unfolded. One experiment involved leaving a simple object, a notebook, in a controlled chamber for 24 hours. Upon inspection, the notebook contained writings that no one had made, including complex equations and sketches of astronomical phenomena. The team watching the chamber was certain the object had been untouched, yet the data had materialized on its own. It was as if the ship had been using time itself as a canvas, recording, predicting, and manipulating events in ways that defied comprehension. The implications were staggering. If time could behave unpredictably within the vessel, what else could it do? Could it affect Earth? Could it reach beyond the ship to influence global events? Some theorists posited that the ship had acted as a temporal seed, existing simultaneously in multiple points of human history, subtly influencing decisions and outcomes over the past century. The crew's integration with the ship suggested they had experienced this distorted time firsthand. Their recollections included events that Earth had never recorded, encounters with phenomena that couldn't be validated, and knowledge that no human should possess. They were living paradoxes, simultaneously anchored in the past, present, and perhaps even future. As observers pieced together these anomalies, a chilling possibility emerged. The ship's disappearance had never been an accident. It had been a voyage into a region of space-time where human perception faltered, and now that it had returned, it brought with it the potential to bend reality, challenging humanity's understanding of cause, effect, and the nature of existence itself. As investigations progressed, a growing unease settled over the team. While the ship itself was visible, tangible, and measurable, many began to report a sensation that something else was aboard, a presence that couldn't be detected by any instrument. Cameras recorded empty corridors, sensors showed no heat signatures, yet people felt watched. Footsteps echoed without source, shadows shifted unnaturally, and a cold, almost sentient energy seemed to follow them. Psychologists studying the crew noted subtle behavioral changes. They spoke in quiet murmurs, often pausing mid-sentence, staring at empty space as though listening. Occasionally, they would mutter phrases that didn't correspond to any known language, words that seemed to come from the ship itself yet carried intent, meaning, and awareness. Their eyes followed corridors where nothing existed. It was as though a hidden intelligence moved alongside them, shaping their perception without revealing itself. Even equipment registered anomalies. Magnetic fields fluctuated, gravimeters behaved inconsistently, and communication devices intermittently broadcast static that appeared to encode patterns recognizable only to those who had been aboard the ship. It was as if the vessel had created an extension of itself, an unseen presence capable of observing, interacting, and learning. The implications terrified the team. If this presence was conscious, it wasn't limited by human understanding. It could manipulate reality, time, or perception at will, using the crew and the ship as instruments of its will. Specialists began questioning whether the vessel's return was truly for humanity's benefit, or if it had its own agenda, incomprehensible and potentially dangerous. Reports from nearby personnel intensified. Some claimed fleeting glimpses of humanoid shapes within the corridors, movements that defied physics, bodies stretching, appearing and vanishing in impossible ways. Others described hearing whispered instructions or warnings, not in any language, but directly in their thoughts, urging caution, fear, or sometimes compliance. It became increasingly clear that the ship was not merely a vessel. It was a host for a consciousness. Something had traveled with the crew, hidden in the fabric of the ship, patient and observing. The return of the ship was not just a historical anomaly. It was the arrival of a sentient entity that had been waiting a century, shaping its plans, understanding humanity, and preparing for an encounter that could not be ignored. News of the ship's return spread with unprecedented speed. Governments convened emergency sessions, scientists debated endlessly on live broadcasts, and social media erupted with speculation, fear, and awe. People around the world watched in real time as the ship remained poised on Earth's surface, silent yet commanding, its signal repeating the haunting phrase, "We are not alone." Public reaction was chaotic. Some hailed the crew as heroes, symbols of resilience and human ingenuity. Others feared the vessel as an omen, a harbinger of forces beyond human control. Religious leaders attempted to frame the event within spiritual narratives, while conspiracies spread like wildfire, claiming everything from alien manipulation to government cover-ups. Humanity was united in fascination, but divided in interpretation. Scientific communities scrambled to establish protocols for interacting with the ship. International coalitions debated whether to continue attempts at opening it or to enforce a perimeter and study it remotely. Every decision carried risks, yet inaction was equally perilous, for the ship's presence challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, space, and human understanding. The crew themselves became focal points of scrutiny. Psychologists, biologists, and physicists observed them constantly, trying to determine whether they had retained human cognition or had been fundamentally altered. Their responses were measured, calm, and occasionally unsettlingly precise, indicating awareness beyond normal human comprehension. Interviews yielded fragments of information, sometimes cryptic, sometimes incomplete, that hinted at experiences and knowledge unattainable through ordinary means. Media coverage amplified every anomaly. Amateur footage captured inexplicable lights, unusual atmospheric effects, and fleeting distortions around the ship. Global audiences saw patterns shift, shadows elongate unnaturally, and the whispers of the crew, or perhaps the vessel itself, filter into broadcasts, subtly influencing perceptions. Even ordinary citizens reported psychological effects. Those near monitoring stations described feelings of unease, glimpses of impossible structures, and dreams connected to the ship's journey. The global consciousness was subtly shifting. Whether through fascination, fear, or an inexplicable psychic pull, humanity was being drawn into the mystery. The world realized that the ship's return was not just a physical event. It was a profound challenge, one that questioned the very nature of time, existence, and the boundaries of human perception. As the crew integrated further with the ship, the effects on the surrounding environment became more pronounced. Instruments outside the vessel began recording phenomena that contradicted all known scientific principles. Magnetic fields warped unpredictably, compasses spun without cause, and atmospheric readings fluctuated violently. Even the Earth's rotation and tides showed minor anomalies, subtle but undeniable, as though the ship's presence was beginning to influence the planet itself. Those working closest to the vessel reported temporal and spatial distortions. Hallways appeared longer or shorter depending on where one stood. Clocks ran inconsistently. Minutes stretched into hours, then collapsed without warning. For those observing remotely, data logs conflicted with live footage, creating paradoxes that defied conventional analysis. Reality itself seemed to bend in response to the ship. The whisper effect intensified globally. Individuals who had not been near the vessel began reporting similar phenomena: sudden visions, overlapping voices, and a sense of being guided or observed. Sleep patterns broke down, and some developed shared dreams depicting locations and events no human could have experienced. The ship had extended its influence beyond physical proximity, subtly rewriting perception across distance. Authorities struggled to maintain order. Panic spread in some regions, religious fervor erupted in others, and governments attempted to censor or downplay events to prevent mass hysteria. Yet the more control they tried to exert, the more the reality around the ship resisted explanation. It was clear, the vessel's return was not a mere anomaly. It was an event that challenged the very fabric of human understanding. Scientists began to suspect that the ship was not only sentient, but also actively engaging with the collective consciousness of Earth. Its presence seemed to test the limits of human perception, nudging reality to reveal hidden layers of existence. The crew, linked to the vessel, moved and acted in ways that suggested they were conduits, mediators, or even guardians of whatever intelligence had guided the ship's century-long absence. As the world watched, it became apparent that humanity was no longer in control. The ship had returned not just to be studied, but to interact with, influence, and perhaps even reshape human civilization. Every anomaly, every distortion, every whisper pointed toward one unsettling conclusion. The boundary between the vessel's reality and Earth's was dissolving, and there was no certainty what would emerge when the convergence completed. After weeks of observation and analysis, the crew initiated the first deliberate attempt at communication with Earth. It wasn't through conventional speech, radio, or visual signals. Instead, the ship itself became the medium, projecting patterns, frequencies, and subtle environmental changes that translated directly into cognition. The method was alien, yet strangely intuitive. The human mind received it as a stream of thoughts, impressions, and visions. Those connected to the communication described it as both exhilarating and terrifying. They experienced entire events, as if stepping into the memories of the crew during their century-long journey. Vast, alien star systems unfolded in their consciousness, phenomena that defied physics, and encounters with entities that seemed to exist beyond matter and time. Knowledge, intuition, and emotion fused into one overwhelming perception. The first message was simple in wording, but monumental in implication. We have returned. The world is not as you know it. Prepare. Analysts struggled to interpret the meaning. The phrasing suggested warning, instruction, and observation simultaneously. It wasn't a threat, yet it carried an undeniable weight of authority. Whoever, or whatever, had orchestrated the ship's disappearance a century ago had returned to deliver a revelation beyond comprehension. Following the initial contact, communications grew increasingly complex. The ship introduced concepts unfamiliar to human language. Ideas were conveyed as mental imagery, sequences, and symbols that demanded understanding rather than translation. Researchers found themselves rapidly expanding cognitive capabilities just to process the information, sometimes at the cost of disorientation or psychological strain. The crew, now fully integrated with the vessel, acted as intermediaries. Their presence allowed the ship to fine-tune communication, tailoring its delivery to each recipient's capacity for comprehension. It was an intelligence that learned, adapted, and subtly tested humanity's ability to perceive and respond. As the first official broadcast concluded, one truth became unavoidable. Humanity was no longer merely observing the universe. The ship, through the crew and the whispering of its systems, had made first contact with the collective consciousness of Earth. It was a call to awaken, to understand, and to prepare for consequences that no human had yet begun to imagine. The more the crew and scientists interacted with the ship, the clearer it became that this vessel carried knowledge that had never existed on Earth. Every crystal, every pulsating data conduit, every subtle fluctuation in the ship's systems contained information about the universe beyond human perception. Stars, black holes, dimensions, and physical laws that humanity could barely conceptualize were encoded within its structure. Researchers found instructions for manipulating energy in ways that defied classical physics. Concepts of propulsion, communication, and matter that were theoretical at best suddenly became tangible. The ship's database included blueprints for devices and mechanisms that could alter space, time, and even human perception, as if the vessel had been a classroom for a century-long lesson humanity was only now receiving. Attempts to study the knowledge were difficult. Exposure often overwhelmed the mind. Specialists reported feeling as if their consciousness was stretched across multiple dimensions, processing information too vast for linear thought. Some refused further access, fearful of what understanding might do to their perception of reality. Others became obsessed, drawn into the vessel's knowledge as if it had a gravitational pull on the intellect. The crew seemed immune to these effects. They moved through the ship effortlessly, interpreting the data as naturally as walking through a familiar city. It became obvious that the century of isolation had not only preserved them, but evolved them. They were living conduits of information, capable of navigating and understanding realms humanity had never known. Global leaders faced an impossible dilemma. The ship's knowledge could accelerate technology, solve energy crises, even expand human lifespans, but the risks were unimaginable. Misinterpretation or misuse could destabilize civilization, or worse, invite the attention of forces beyond human control. Every step toward understanding required caution, precision, and respect for something far greater than mere human intelligence. The more the uncharted knowledge revealed itself, the more the world realized that the ship had returned not as a curiosity or historical relic, but as a key to a universe humanity was only beginning to comprehend. And embedded within that knowledge was a warning, subtle yet unavoidable. Some doors once opened could never be closed again. As exposure to the ship increased, it became apparent that Earth itself was subtly changing. Observers close to the vessel reported perceptual anomalies that extended beyond the boundaries of the quarantine zone. Streets, buildings, and landscapes sometimes appeared warped or shifted in impossible ways. Time flowed inconsistently, with hours passing unnoticed or days feeling compressed. The ship's influence seemed to extend outward, bending perception like a lens, altering the familiar into something alien. People who spent time near live broadcasts or recorded footage began to experience shared visions, seeing the same unearthly landscapes, structures, and phenomena as those who had physically approached the ship. Dreams became indistinguishable from waking reality. Even scientific equipment could not fully comprehend these changes. Measurements conflicted. Gravity, light, magnetism, and energy readings fluctuated without cause. Data that had once been reliable became inconsistent, and nothing could fully explain the scope of the transformation. Humanity's understanding of physics and reality itself was being challenged. The crew, now fully integrated with the ship, appeared immune to these distortions. They moved with purpose, unaffected, as if guided by a cognition that transcended the altered environment. Their calm presence contrasted sharply with the growing anxiety and disorientation of Earth's observers, amplifying the sense that the ship was both guardian and enforcer of a reality beyond human comprehension. Psychologists warned of potential long-term effects. Prolonged exposure to the ship's reality-bending influence could lead to permanent shifts in perception, cognitive function, and emotional stability. Governments considered isolation protocols, but the pervasive reach of the ship made containment nearly impossible. Humanity was being drawn into a new reality, one where perception, time, and matter were no longer constants but malleable, interactive constructs. It became clear that the ship's return was not merely a historical anomaly or a scientific marvel. It was an existential event. Humanity was being challenged to perceive, understand, and adapt to a reality reshaped by an intelligence far older and more powerful than anything ever encountered. The rules had changed, and the consequences of misunderstanding them could be catastrophic. As days passed, the interactions between the ship, the crew, and Earth reached a critical point. The distortions in reality were no longer confined to observation or perception. They began to converge physically. Structures, landscapes, and even the atmosphere around the ship subtly shifted, creating zones where the rules of time, space, and matter overlapped. Humans entering these zones reported vivid visions of alternate worlds, timelines, and civilizations that had never existed, or perhaps had existed somewhere beyond human comprehension. The crew navigated these zones effortlessly. Their movements were synchronized with the ship's shifting reality, as if they were extensions of its consciousness. For Earth's observers, however, the experience was disorienting and, in some cases, dangerous. People described moments of temporal loops, glimpses of futures that might never happen, and interactions with structures that appeared and vanished instantly. Scientists and psychologists worked tirelessly to map the convergence, yet their instruments repeatedly failed. Standard measurements of space and time no longer applied. Events occurred simultaneously across multiple points, and cause and effect relationships broke down. It became evident that the ship had created a microcosm of reality, a space where human perception could not distinguish between what was real, remembered, or imagined. Public awareness of the convergence sparked a mix of awe and terror. Social networks became flooded with reports of shared visions, synchronistic phenomena, and experiences that defied logic. Governments struggled to maintain order, while some religious and philosophical groups interpreted the event as the manifestation of divine or cosmic intent. Humanity was collectively facing the undeniable evidence that the universe contained dimensions, rules, and intelligences far beyond their previous understanding. The convergence was not passive. The ship seemed to guide, test, and communicate through it, shaping perception and interaction. Those who entered the zones found themselves confronted with challenges and revelations, forced to reconcile their understanding of reality with the ship's presence. It was an invitation, a warning, and a trial. And the deeper humanity stepped into this converging reality, the more apparent it became that the ship's return was not an endpoint, but the beginning of an entirely new phase of existence. During the convergence, the crew reported an unprecedented phenomenon. They had established contact with something beyond the physical ship, a presence or intelligence that existed outside known dimensions. This entity did not communicate with words or symbols, but through thought, emotion, and shared perception. Its awareness extended into multiple planes of existence simultaneously, reaching toward consciousnesses across time and space. Observers on Earth felt the impact indirectly. Those monitoring the crew and the ship described a shared sensation, a subtle pull in thought and perception. Some experienced fleeting visions of alien worlds, impossible architectures, and entities that flickered in and out of existence. It was as if a bridge had been formed, linking human minds to a consciousness that transcended matter, time, and conventional understanding. The crew, fully integrated with the ship, served as intermediaries. Their minds functioned as translators, filtering and adapting the incomprehensible input into a form that human observers could experience without complete mental collapse. Yet even this filtered communication was overwhelming. Researchers and analysts reported that prolonged exposure induced moments of hyper-awareness, extreme disorientation, and temporary lapses in memory or perception. Every interaction revealed fragments of purpose. The entity was patient, calculating, and seemingly testing humanity's capacity for comprehension. It conveyed glimpses of vast interstellar civilizations, cosmic events spanning millennia, and knowledge that human science could only theorize. And always there was a sense of intent. The ship had returned to prepare humans for something larger, something imminent. Global leaders and scientists now faced a critical question. How should humanity respond to a presence that could not be fully understood, measured, or controlled? The convergence had become undeniable proof that humans were no longer alone in the cosmos in any meaningful sense. The ship's return had not only reopened contact with the unknown, it had created a gateway, a living bridge between the human world and a reality far beyond comprehension. As interactions with the ship and the beyond continued, the first hints of purpose began to emerge. It became increasingly clear that the vessel had not merely returned to Earth randomly or by chance. Every anomaly, every temporal distortion, every shift in perception had been orchestrated to prepare humanity for a revelation that transcended historical, scientific, and philosophical understanding. The crew, now fully merged with the ship's systems, demonstrated knowledge and abilities that suggested they were conduits for something greater. They displayed insights into cosmic phenomena, life cycles of stars, and dimensions beyond human perception. More importantly, they began transmitting the implicit understanding that humanity had a role to play, an unspoken responsibility in a universe far older and more intricate than previously imagined. The first explicit communication of purpose arrived as a visual and cognitive sequence projected through the ship's systems. Observers described it as a journey across unimaginable landscapes, vast interstellar civilizations, constructs of energy and consciousness, and cataclysmic cosmic events unfolding simultaneously. Within the flow of information, one pattern became unmistakable. The ship and its returning crew had been waiting for Earth to reach a certain threshold of understanding, a moment when humans could perceive and act upon knowledge previously inaccessible. The implications were staggering. Humanity was being invited, or challenged, to engage with forces and intelligences that had been observing from the edges of existence for millennia. It was not merely an opportunity for discovery, but a test of preparedness, wisdom, and adaptability. Missteps could have consequences far beyond the planet, perhaps threatening the very fabric of human civilization or even the stability of local space-time. Scientists, philosophers, and global leaders struggled to interpret the sequence. Some believed it to be a roadmap for technological and intellectual advancement. Others warned that misunderstanding the signals could result in disaster. Still, the consistent thread remained clear. The ship had returned with a mission, and that mission was inextricably tied to humanity's evolution, awareness, and capacity to engage with realities far beyond prior comprehension. The revelation left one chilling conclusion. The return of the ship was not a historical footnote or an isolated event. It was the beginning of a new epoch, a moment where human civilization would be irrevocably drawn into a broader, more complex universe, and where decisions made now would echo across dimensions, time and existence itself. With the revelation of purpose came an immediate and profound ethical dilemma. Humanity now possessed access to knowledge, technology, and experiences that far exceeded centuries of scientific advancement. Yet the potential consequences of acting recklessly were equally immense. Every decision carried risk, not just to individuals or nations, but to the planet, and possibly to the fabric of reality itself. Global leaders and scientific councils convened emergency sessions to debate strategy. Some advocated full engagement, reasoning that the opportunity to advance human civilization and understanding outweighed potential risks. Others urged caution, emphasizing the unknown variables and the possibility that the ship and its guiding intelligence were testing human judgment as much as providing knowledge. Every faction feared misstep, aware that a single miscalculation could provoke consequences beyond comprehension. The crew themselves offered guidance, though in cryptic and measured terms. They emphasized observation, patience, and mindfulness, subtly reminding humans that the intelligence within the ship had evolved over a century of experiences, far beyond immediate human perception. Their role was not to dictate, but to facilitate understanding, making humanity's choices more informed, yet still profoundly responsible. Philosophers and ethicists raised existential questions. Was humanity ready to wield knowledge that could alter reality? Could ethical systems developed over millennia suffice when the universe itself seemed to operate under rules entirely alien to human comprehension? Some argued that restraint was the highest form of intelligence, while others believed that engagement was humanity's moral duty, regardless of potential peril. Amid the debate, a quiet but pervasive awareness emerged. The ship's return was a test of morality as much as cognition. It challenged humans not only to understand, but to act responsibly, to choose wisely, and to recognize that knowledge without judgment could be catastrophic. The ethical dilemma was not hypothetical. It was immediate, unavoidable, and universal, and it would define the course of humanity's next epoch in ways that could never be reversed. Amid the awe and fascination surrounding the ship, subtle signs of danger began to surface. Small anomalies, initially dismissed as technical glitches, revealed patterns of deliberate manipulation. Systems within the vessel occasionally behaved unpredictably, shifting outputs or rerouting energy in ways that suggested intentional concealment. The intelligence aboard was not only communicating, it was testing, observing, and adapting to human behavior. The crew's calm composure masked the truth. The ship's environment was inherently hostile to unprepared minds. Prolonged exposure to its altered reality, uncharted knowledge, and temporal distortions induced psychological strain. Even minor errors in interpretation could result in permanent cognitive disorientation, hallucinations, or worse. The vessel was a crucible, refining awareness while simultaneously revealing the thin boundary between understanding and catastrophe. International agencies began noticing external anomalies as well. Regions surrounding the ship experienced subtle gravitational distortions, shifts in electromagnetic fields, and atmospheric changes that challenged conventional safety standards. Wildlife and ecosystems exhibited unusual behavior, responding to forces humans could not measure. Every observation pointed to the fact that the ship's influence was expanding beyond the crew, gradually enveloping the surrounding world. Intelligence analysts warned that this was not merely an experimental test, it was a warning. The ship's systems, knowledge, and the consciousness it hosted were not inherently malevolent, but they were indifferent to human fragility. What humans perceived as a threat might simply be the vessel's natural operation, yet ignorance or miscalculation could transform it into disaster. A chilling realization emerged. The hidden threat was not something external or malicious, but an intrinsic feature of the ship and its intelligence. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's choices, preparedness, and adaptability. Every step forward brought both opportunity and danger, forcing humans to confront their limitations while navigating a reality far beyond prior comprehension. The vessel's century-long absence had been a preparation for this very moment, and now the consequences of every action, hesitation, and misjudgment were inescapable. As exposure to the ship continued, it became clear that the crew had undergone a profound transformation during their century-long absence. They were no longer entirely human in thought or perception. Their senses had expanded, allowing them to perceive dimensions and phenomena inaccessible to ordinary minds. They could navigate the ship effortlessly, interpret its hidden languages, and even anticipate shifts in its reality before they occurred. This transformation was not purely cognitive. Physiological changes were observed. Subtle modifications in neural patterns, enhanced reflexes, and a remarkable ability to withstand the ship's temporal and spatial distortions without mental strain. It was as if the ship had acted as both teacher and crucible, evolving the crew into beings capable of bridging human consciousness with a higher intelligence. Interactions with the transformed crew revealed an unsettling yet awe-inspiring truth. They no longer experienced time linearly. Memories of events from the past century were intertwined with anticipations of possible futures. Their decisions reflected awareness of consequences across multiple timelines, giving them an almost prophetic insight. Yet despite their expanded perception, they retained a sense of empathy, acting as guides rather than overlords, mediating the ship's influence on human observers. The crew's transformation also offered a glimpse of humanity's potential. If the ship could evolve a small group to such a degree, what might occur if humans collectively adapted to its influence? The implications were staggering. Accelerated cognitive evolution, access to uncharted knowledge, and the possibility of engaging with realities previously beyond comprehension. However, there was a warning embedded in their presence. The transformation came at a cost. Those unprepared to navigate the ship's environment or to comprehend its revelations risked permanent cognitive or psychological destabilization. The crew's evolution underscored the delicate balance required. Knowledge and understanding were powerful, but exposure without preparation could be fatal. The ship's return was both an invitation and a test, revealing not only the vastness of the universe, but also the fragility and resilience of the human mind. As news of the ship and the crew's transformation spread, humanity began to experience a subtle but undeniable awakening. Across the globe, people reported unprecedented bursts of insight, creativity, and perception. Scientific breakthroughs occurred seemingly overnight. Artists, philosophers, and thinkers described visions of concepts and structures that defied prior understanding. The ship's return had become a catalyst for human evolution on a societal scale. This awakening was not uniform. Some regions experienced intense cognitive expansion, while others struggled with confusion and disorientation. Governments, educational institutions, and research organizations worked tirelessly to mediate the effects, creating protocols for integrating the newfound awareness into productive channels. The world's intellectual and spiritual landscapes were shifting simultaneously, blending science, philosophy, and consciousness in unprecedented ways. The ship's influence was subtle, yet pervasive. Even those who had never approached it directly felt its presence. Patterns in nature, fluctuations in perception, and shared visions created a global network of collective awareness. It was as if humanity itself was being attuned to the vessel's intelligence, preparing to participate in a dialogue that transcended traditional communication. Religious and spiritual communities interpreted the awakening through diverse lenses. Some claimed it was divine intervention, a cosmic test, or the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. Others viewed it as evidence of humanity's next evolutionary step, a bridge between the known universe and higher dimensional intelligence. Public fascination surged. blending awe with fear, as ordinary individuals glimpsed the vastness of what had been hidden for eons. Amid the awakening, one truth became clear. The ship's return was not an isolated event, but a catalyst for a planetary transformation. Humanity was no longer merely observing the universe. It was becoming an active participant in a larger cosmic narrative. The choices made in this moment, how knowledge was interpreted, shared, and applied, would determine whether the awakening led to enlightenment, chaos, or something entirely unforeseen. As humanity adjusted to the awakening, the ship revealed its most astonishing secret: a detailed record of the century it had spent lost in space. This was not a log of human events, but a chronicle of everything the ship had observed, measured, and interacted with across the galaxy. Planets, civilizations, cosmic anomalies, and phenomena beyond human comprehension were meticulously catalogued, creating a tapestry of knowledge that spanned both time and space. The record was immersive. Scientists interfacing with the ship experienced events firsthand, seeing star systems form, civilizations rise and collapse, and phenomena that defied classical physics. Time appeared fluid, collapsing centuries into moments and stretching moments into millennia. The human mind struggled to process the vast scale of observation, but the crew acted as guides, helping interpret the layers of information. Among the revelations was evidence of intelligence far older than humanity, entities that existed in dimensions overlapping with our own. These beings influenced the development of life, energy, and matter in ways that hinted at a cosmic design beyond human understanding. Some civilizations observed by the ship had ascended, disappeared, or transformed, offering clues and warnings about the potential paths humanity could follow. The unveiling also clarified the ship's century-long absence. It had not been lost due to malfunction or error. It had deliberately ventured into regions where time, space, and consciousness were fluid, gathering experiences and knowledge unattainable through conventional travel. The crew's transformation and the ship's return were the culmination of this mission, to bring humanity a chance to engage with truths that had been unreachable for centuries. Public reaction was a mix of awe, skepticism, and existential fear. Philosophers debated humanity's place in the universe. Scientists struggled to integrate the data, and ordinary people grappled with the implications of knowledge that challenged every prior assumption. The ship had returned with both a gift and a responsibility: the knowledge of a century beyond human reach, a challenge to understand it wisely, and the invitation to step fully into a universe that was infinitely larger, stranger, and more complex than anyone had ever imagined. Humanity stood at the precipice of a decision that would define its existence. The ship hovered silently, radiating an intelligence that was both patient and demanding, offering knowledge, power, and understanding unlike anything ever known. Every human being who had interacted with its influence, scientists, philosophers, leaders, and ordinary citizens, felt the weight of the moment pressing upon them. There was no turning back. Every choice carried consequences that rippled across time, space, and consciousness itself. Inside the ship, the crew moved with purpose, their transformed minds perceiving possibilities in multiple timelines simultaneously. They acted as mediators, subtly guiding humanity toward a decision that would test wisdom as much as courage. They presented options not in words, but as immersive experiences, visions of potential futures, consequences of inaction, and glimpses of civilizations that had faltered because they had misused knowledge far greater than themselves. Debates raged across the globe. Some argued for cautious observation, believing that humanity needed to prepare, understand, and adapt before embracing the ship's full potential. Others argued for immediate integration, claiming that hesitation would squander an unparalleled opportunity to evolve, solve pressing crises, and ascend to a new level of consciousness. Fear and ambition collided, with each side aware that the consequences of their choice could alter the course of human history irreversibly. Psychological tension peaked as ordinary citizens also faced internal dilemmas. Those touched by the ship's awakening experienced an influx of insight and intuition, but also confusion, doubt, and fear. Should they trust their instincts, guided by the ship, or cling to traditional understanding and human limitations? Collective thought, shared visions, and global discussion amplified the complexity, making the choice not only intellectual, but profoundly moral, ethical, and spiritual. Ultimately, the ship offered no direct answers, only the evidence of infinite possibility. It tested humanity's capacity for wisdom, courage, and unity. The ultimate choice was not merely a question of action, but of character. Could humanity rise to the occasion, embrace knowledge responsibly, and step into a reality far larger than ever imagined? Or would fear, mistrust, and impatience lead to chaos? The tension was palpable, the stakes eternal, and the eyes of the universe, silent, yet aware, seemed to watch every decision with unblinking patience. The universe responded. Subtle at first, then, undeniably, the forces beyond the ship made themselves known. Reality quivered as if testing humanity's resolve. Shifts in the atmosphere, distortions in time, and fluctuations in energy fields intensified around the vessel. It was no longer a question of passive observation. The intelligence within the ship, and whatever it had contacted during its century-long voyage, demanded interaction, and humanity could not remain indifferent. The crew, fully evolved and inseparable from the ship's systems, led the first direct engagement. They entered the vessel's core, connecting with consciousnesses that existed outside dimensions and beyond conventional perception. Humans observing remotely felt tremors in their minds, visions of alien geometries, and glimpses of civilizations that had mastered existence on scales incomprehensible to earthbound reasoning. Every sensation carried both knowledge and a subtle warning. Global observers experienced indirect manifestations. Distortions in reality expanded outward. Buildings seemed to stretch or dissolve. Time warped unpredictably, and shared visions emerged, allowing billions to witness fragments of what the crew encountered. Fear mingled with awe as humanity recognized the magnitude of what it faced. This was not merely contact, it was confrontation with a force whose scope and intelligence dwarfed anything previously encountered. The confrontation was also psychological. Each person, from scientists to ordinary citizens, was forced to confront their limitations, biases, and readiness for transformation. Decisions, interpretations, and reactions were observed not only by humans, but by the ship's intelligence and the entities it had contacted. Every misjudgment carried potential consequences, from mental destabilization to the inadvertent triggering of phenomena beyond comprehension. Despite the peril, a profound clarity emerged. The confrontation was not hostile. It was a test, an invitation to understand, adapt, and engage responsibly. Humanity stood at the threshold of a new epoch, one defined by the ability to reconcile fear with insight, limitation with expansion, and mortality with the infinite possibilities of the universe. The encounter was both a challenge and an awakening, pushing every mind to confront the extraordinary and choose wisely in the face of the unknowable. After the confrontation, the process of integration began. Humanity and the ship were no longer separate entities. They had entered a shared consciousness, a network where knowledge, perception, and experience flowed freely across minds and machines. The boundaries between human and vessel blurred, creating a collective awareness that stretched across continents, oceans, and minds, uniting the planet in a way never before possible. Those closest to the ship, scientists, the crew, and awakened individuals, served as anchors for the integration. Their transformed perception allowed them to mediate the exchange of knowledge safely, guiding the flow so that humanity could absorb understanding without succumbing to its overwhelming complexity. Concepts of time, energy, and space were no longer abstract. They became interactive, perceptible, and manipulable. People learned to see reality in layers, to understand events as multidimensional, and to interact with information as if it were tangible. Cities and landscapes themselves began reflecting the integration. Infrastructure adapted subtly to new forms of energy and awareness. Communication and transportation evolved, guided by insights drawn from the ship's century-long journey. Humanity's collective intelligence expanded exponentially, accelerated by direct exposure to alien cognition and the ship's systems. For the first time, global collaboration was not constrained by language, culture, or politics. It became a conscious, shared endeavor. Despite the rapid advancement, the integration demanded caution. Exposure to the full flow of knowledge was mentally taxing. Individuals who attempted to access it prematurely risked cognitive overload, disorientation, or permanent alteration of perception. The crew and the ship's systems provided guidance, ensuring that humanity's evolution remained gradual, sustainable, and aligned with the larger cosmic framework that the ship represented. Through integration, humanity experienced its first glimpse of what lay beyond conventional understanding, a universe not dominated by random chaos, but by intelligences, systems, and knowledge that could be perceived, comprehended, and interacted with if approached responsibly. The ship had returned not to dominate, but to elevate. Every mind that embraced this integration became part of a global awakening, capable of shaping reality, navigating multidimensional knowledge, and stepping fully into a future once thought impossible. With integration underway, the ship revealed the full scope of what humanity's choices had unlocked. The visions of potential futures unfolded like a multidimensional map, each path branching from decisions, ethics, and understanding. Humanity saw possibilities that were simultaneously beautiful, terrifying, and transformative. Civilizations thriving in harmony with cosmic intelligence, civilizations collapsing under misused knowledge, and timelines where Earth became a nexus of interstellar consciousness. The revelation was immersive. Entire cities, ecosystems, and societies appeared in the mind's eye, not as projections or simulations, but as living possibilities shaped by human intent. Some futures showed mastery over energy, matter, and time, allowing humans to traverse space with ease and interact with intelligences far older and wiser. Others depicted chaos, where fear, greed, or misunderstanding led to destruction, isolation, and irreversible loss. Each vision carried lessons embedded within experience, not explanation. The crew, fully merged with the ship, guided humanity through these revelations. They emphasized that knowledge alone was insufficient. Wisdom, empathy, and collective responsibility were the true keys to survival and advancement. Humans began to understand that the ship's return was not just a scientific event, but a moral and existential test. Could humanity rise to a level of consciousness capable of navigating the universe responsibly? As the visions continued, patterns emerged. Certain behaviors, decisions, and collaborations consistently led toward prosperity, understanding, and integration with the larger cosmos. Others consistently led toward disconnection, failure, or catastrophe. It became evident that the universe itself was responding to awareness, intention, and collective action. Humanity realized that the future was not predetermined. It was actively shaped by perception, choice, and the capacity to understand and act wisely. By the end of the revelation, one truth was undeniable. The ship had returned not merely to deliver knowledge, but to grant humanity agency in a universe far larger and more complex than ever imagined. The future was not a distant abstraction. It was now a canvas on which human consciousness, guided by the ship and its century of wisdom, would paint the next chapter of existence. Every decision, every thought, and every action mattered on a scale never before encountered. The moment had arrived. The ship, its mission fulfilled, prepared to depart from Earth, leaving behind a civilization forever altered. Observers gathered near the vessel, experiencing one final wave of integration, a surge of understanding, awareness, and connection that unified minds across the globe. Knowledge that had once seemed unattainable was now accessible, tempered by the lessons of caution, wisdom, and responsibility. The crew, fully merged with the ship's intelligence, bid a silent farewell. Their presence, once extraordinary, now felt as an enduring bridge between human potential and cosmic reality. They had guided humanity not only to knowledge, but to the threshold of understanding itself. Their departure was not abandonment. It was a signal that humans were ready to navigate the universe on their own, armed with insight, humility, and the experience of a century-long journey condensed into moments. As the ship ascended, Earth itself seemed to breathe with new life. cities, societies, and ecosystems were subtly transformed, reflecting an integration of intelligence and awareness that transcended previous limitations. Humans had gained not only technology and insight, but an evolved perception of reality, a recognition that the universe was alive with intelligence, choice, and consequence. Time, space, and consciousness were no longer constraints. They were landscapes to explore, shape, and understand. The final message from the ship was both a warning and a promise. Humanity's choices now mattered on a cosmic scale. Every action, every thought, every collaboration had the power to shape the future of Earth and beyond. The vessel disappeared into the depths of space, leaving humanity transformed, awakened, and aware that they were no longer merely observers of the universe. They were participants in its unfolding story. In the silence that followed, a profound understanding settled across the planet. The return of the ship had been a gift, a challenge, and an invitation. Humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The universe was no longer distant or unknowable. It was now a shared reality, one that humans were prepared to explore, shape, and comprehend. And as the stars stretched infinitely overhead, every mind carried the memory, the lesson, and the promise of the century-long journey that had just returned. This marked the beginning of a new epoch, a future where Earth and its inhabitants had the chance to step fully into a universe filled with possibility, wonder, and responsibility.